Going back to the second line of meta-ethical examination of Kantian ethics, namely the question whether Kantian ethics has a bias for masculine-identified capacities and a prejudice against feminine-identified ones. The critique of traditional moral theory as being too rationalistic has been developed by some feminist ethical theorists in the direction of articulating an alternative normative ethical theory. Notably, Nell Noddings's Ethics of Care, which was influenced by Carol Gilligan's feminist critique of Kohlberg's psychological account of moral development. Sarah Ruddick's articulation and defense of maternal thinking as a model of ethical and political practice is also an important work in this regard. Taken collectively, this type of approach to feminist ethical theorizing provides us with the following insights. 1. That ethical deliberation can be enriched by a recognition of the necessary role played by affective responses that theories with masculinist biases tend to exclude or at least underutilize. And 2, that the experience of women as mothers, as caregivers, as human beings whose lives are intimately immersed in the daily and mundane encounters with vulnerability, are a fertile ground for the cultivation of ethical perspectives and sensibilities, no less rational and no less fundamental than those that are articulated by the male voices in the ethical canon. But a caveat: feminine versus feminist ethics. Although it is undoubtedly important to recognize that gender stereotypes in mainstream normative ethical theories may blind us to the specificity of the experiences of women, I also wish to express my reservations about the idea that there are two types of moral reasoning or two modes of moral experience, namely one male, the other female. There is a big difference between saying that the experiences which are prevalent among women, at least in our existing societies, experiences which have previously been neglected by mainstream ethical theories, are a rich source of insight about moral deliberation, and saying that there is a mode of moral experience or approach to moral decision-making that is typical of women or characteristically feminine. In other words, it's one thing to say that the experience of caring for the needy and the vulnerable gives us access to an enhanced understanding of our moral obligations and an enhanced capacity to respond to the moral claims of others. And another thing to say that this way of experiencing and responding to moral problems is typically feminine, or the forte of women. I'm okay with the first, but I find the second problematic. The tendency to think of the ethics of care, or more broadly, ethics from the standpoint of women, as ethics for women, or as feminine ethics, runs the risk of merely reinforcing gender stereotypes that relegate women to the sphere of the non-rational, the sphere of immediate feeling, of intuition, emotion, sympathy, and men to the sphere of more deliberate and calculative rationality. There is a danger that in thinking of these alternative approaches to ethics as feminine rather than as feminist ethics, we might end up limiting the ethical agency of women to the private and domestic sphere, or the sphere of immediate human interaction, while continuing to reserve the sphere of social-political action to men. Think about this, for instance. The fact that Vice President Leni Robredo, removed from the cabinet early in her vice presidency, and more recently fired by the president from her 2-week stint as co-chair of the Interagency Committee on Anti-Illegal Drugs, the fact that she is barely tolerated by the Duterte administration, even as her office has been doing wonders in helping frontliners during the COVID-19 pandemic. Think about the fact that even in the public sphere, women are assigned the caregiver roles. And just as in the workplace, women in care work are expected to labor for smaller wages, the office of the Vice President is left to yield the labor of care on a shoestring budget. Both in the private, domestic, and the public national scale, care work, which is overwhelmingly, if not exclusively, assigned to women, is socially undervalued. Feminist ethics, I would say, should be less about teaching masculine ethics to welcome its feminine side, but more about sharpening one's appreciation of ethical issues in the sphere of gender relations. Or, put more simply, it should be about sharpening one's awareness of injustice owing to sexism. In other words, the primary task of feminist ethics consists in the following. 1. Making us more sensitive to ethical problems pertaining to gender. Feminist ethics should enable us to spot issues of gender injustice. It should make us, whatever our gender, more capable of identifying injustice owing to sexism. 2. Making us more sensitive to the fact that our own understanding of what counts as an ethical issue may be colored by our assumptions about gender. And 3, making us aware that our understanding of moral agency is shaped by biases and stereotypes about gender. One last example. I want to give you an example to illustrate what I mean by that, by those tasks of feminist ethics. So, for example, in order to recognize and reject blaming victims of sexual assault, one has to come from a perspective that acknowledges the unequal power relation between men and women. And from this perspective, see that the very notion of consent is a gendered notion. So the notion of consent is a core concept in ethics. To approach ethics from a feminist perspective would mean, in this instance, asking whether this concept of consent is itself a gendered concept. Why is it that what a woman is wearing is seen as an expression of her consent for what can be done to her? A passive way of assenting to a passive position? I say passive because the focus of these supposedly moral calculations is not about what she wants to do, but what she presumably allows to be done to her. Does this way of representing rape perhaps suggest that when it comes to sex, this tacit assent of a woman suffices? Because after all, we do not expect women to speak. Because after all, we do not expect her to verbalize her will. Is it because, for the most part, our society cares less about the free and informed consent of women than it does about the desires and decisions of men? This is an example of thinking through the questions, are our ethical categories gendered categories? And if they are, what are the consequences of this gendering of our moral categories? Victim blaming is one such consequence of the double standards that we apply to consent. So, what is feminist ethics? Feminist ethics is a mode of questioning rather than a body of tenets or positions. Just as in ethics in general, or any field of theory and practice for that matter, there is a lot of disagreement among even those who have shared commitments. So too in feminist ethics, it would be a mistake to think that there is a feminist approach or position in exclusion of others. Feminist ethics is a living discourse. It's a vital field of inquiry and debate, with many questions and no final answers, because human beings have not yet figured out how to live the reality of our gendered lives in a way that does justice to all of us. Nevertheless, despite the wide variety of feminist approaches and positions, there are features that I take to be hallmarks of a feminist ethical inquiry, namely, a recognition and criticism of gender inequality and gender-based injustice, critique of ethical frameworks, concepts, and related cultural presuppositions insofar as these undermine the agency of women, as well as those marginalized based on their gender identity and sexual orientation. And finally, a deliberate effort to listen to the voices of women, to learn about their experiences and perspectives on morality and moral issues. In other words, to acknowledge that women have something to say about moral issues. At its core, feminist ethics is about bringing women to the table of moral deliberation and the field of social and political action. Thank you very much.